give their names before speaking so that that's clear for the record and the live stream. I'll move to take any apologies. I have an apology for Councillor Bowen.
Mr. Chair, just an apology for late arrival, just sorting out some urgent council business.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Any other apologies?
I understand there's an apology for early departure from Councillor Finlay.
Yep, he's nodding as well. We can get those to the screen. I'll look to move those. Seconded by Councillor Butt. There being no comment, I'll ask for the vote. Apparently by hand today. In favor? That appears to be unanimous. With that, I will adjourn environmental sustainability and hand to the Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. Kia ora tātou, nau mai, haere mai, and welcome to our Palmerston City Council Extraordinary Council meeting of Wednesday the 15th of September 2021. And just before we do start proceedings, just like to acknowledge our nation's special relationship with Māori, tangata whenua. It is Te Wiki o Te Reo Māori, Māori Language Week this week, and Kia kaha Te Reo Māori, it's very special. So councillors, thank you Councillor Barrett for going through the housekeeping. I don't have to do that now, appreciate that. Obviously being in level 2, I apologise if you struggle to hear us at times. These masks are a necessity at this stage. So please bear with us out there. And to my council colleagues, maybe we just take a little bit of time, speak clearly, and so everybody can hear. For the, we will to make life a little bit more difficult, to not make it more difficult, we will look to suspend standing orders around standing to present or speak to a motion or an amendment. So councillors, I'm quite happy to move that, seconded by Councillor Naylor. I haven't seen you for a little while. I'm sorry. So look, is there any comments for that? There being none, we'll do it by a show of hands. All those in favour? Against? Abstain? It's carried unanimously. Thank you. We'll move through the order paper, councillors, and today, apologies. I haven't received any apologies for the full house. Thank you. Notification of additional items. I haven't received anything. Declarations of interest, if there are any. Again, I haven't received any. And we will now look to have a presentation and a warm welcome to Peter Wells. Peter's the chair of the Food and Fibre Group. Peter, so if you'd just like to come up, it seems like you're a long, long way away there, but just switch the microphone on, Peter. You have 10 minutes to, it should be on.
Kia ora, Peter Wells, Food and Fibre Chairman. Your Worship, the Mayor and Councillors. Thank you for the opportunity to speak before you make your decision on the Nature's Call option to address the city's wastewater for the next 30 years and beyond. My group of rural volunteers was offered the opportunity to work with the Nature's Call technical team on the detail of the discharge to land and the wider options from a rural perspective. Now I have a presentation here, I'm just expecting that to come up.
Okay, Peter, we're having some technical difficulties. I wonder if that could be circulated.
We have
Sure,
emailed it just through
sure.
to
It
elected
is-
members now, so they'll have it in front of them.
Sure. Okay, I do have a copy in front of me so I can speak to it. That is a shame. The Food and Fibre Group acknowledge the difficulty of the disposal of the city's wastewater for the next 35 years and beyond. Our core group, whilst all farmers have a record of community involvement outside their farms and have taken a measured view and accept that based on the information provided around nutrient loading at low river levels, some wastewater discharge to land is required, with the option to sea being excluded, which was our preferred option. But the evidence presented to us is not compelling to take large areas of rural land as proposed under some of the BPO options. This presentation will outline points to support our plea for capping the land needed for the wastewater discharge to land for cost, community and environmental reasons. But we're making it easy for you. We support the recommendation taken from the agenda and copied below. I'm not going to read it out, but limiting the area of land to a maximum of 760 hectares, and to point 2 of the recommendation, but not with the addition of any more land for wastewater irrigation discharge. So I'm just going to run through the various options around what is being proposed. So wastewater irrigation is proposed. The aim is to get the nutrient out of the river at low levels and onto land. So how do we do that? The wastewater is irrigated onto land and the nutrient, mainly nitrogen and phosphorus, is taken up by plants. Plants are then harvested for stock feed, removing the excess nutrient from the soil and allowing more wastewater to be applied. This is referred to cut and carry. Key here is the correct soil type and application rate, so the plants can thrive and can continue to take up nutrient before it's lost to the groundwater or runoff, contaminating the environment. The slide, which I hope you've got in front of you, was presented to us on the left by the PDP consulting team, which is the proposed area for the outfall, and on the right is a map in the BPO outlining some of the preferred area. So my next slide shows a Landcare soil map, again presented to us by the PDB consultancy team. And what it shows is that most of the proposed area are what called glade soils and poorly drained. The PPO consultation booklet referred during this process to the preferred soil type needing to be alluvial soils, silty and free draining. Now, significant amounts of the proposed area were swampland. Most farms in the proposed area are intensively drained with open drains and field tiles, are not free draining. And the picture on your bottom right of that is a picture of my farm yesterday, albeit after a significant amount of rain. That's a 4-hectare paddock and there's a kilometre of field tiles in there which are required to drain that paddock, otherwise the water will sit there for a couple of weeks. We question whether poorly drained soils in the proposed area are suitable for the discharge as proposed of up to 500 millimetres per annum per hectare on top of an average rainfall of 900 millimetres annual rainfall. And the whole area is full of Horizons drainage schemes, effectively to flood protect and remove the water from the land. The technical team presented to us and stated that their proposal could work on imperfectly drained soils but would require more land, and we assume more cost. But you can see from the map there's actually very little imperfectly drained soils in the proposed area. Another power problem. Apologies, councillors. I hope this can reflect in the time I've got allowed. But I should be well under. Thank you. Right, so there we've got the maps proposed to us by the consultancy team on the left. So that stretches from Stanson almost to Shannon. And then we've pulled out a map from the BPO documents, which is quite a smaller preferred area. Look, we think it's a bit flawed that you haven't been given more tighter information on where this land is likely to be. Perhaps could we just go to the next slide, please? Okay, so here we've got the Landcare Map, and it's again provided to us by the PDP consultancy team. And the mid-blue is poorly drained, the light blue is imperfectly drained. So there's not a lot of area close to Palmerston North as proposed that will be suitable for what is proposed. Okay, moving on. Next slide, please. So effectively what is proposed is a cut and carry model, which is really common. My farm itself does exactly that. So cut and carry is proposed for a project net income of $2,000 a hectare with the plant species lucerne and barley. However, dairy farms, the biggest users of supplementary feed, can't use human wastewater in a cut and carry operation based on consumer perception overseas, and this will probably extend to beef and lamb over time. And lucerne won't persist on most of the soils as proposed. Current farms don't make $2,000 a hectare under these operations, so suspect with a limited sale for this product that the net income is grossly overstated, which will lead to increased costs of the annual running of this proposal. Rural community, next slide please. The likely rural community affected by the discharge to land weren't required to be consulted under the BPO and haven't. With initial recommendations of up to 2,000 hectares for land discharge, which is 20 square kilometres, this will impact hugely on the rural community and lifestylers. And we're still talking about 8 square kilometres under the 760 hectare proposal. BPO recommendations 25th of August assume land will be acquired under the Public Works Act. We note that won't be your preference, but we still suspect people will be pressured to sell their land. There's some real anxiety in the community of all ages. Would you like the lifestyles around your home affected by city's wastewater? Possibly being encouraged to sell your property? I think not. Look, it would be really helpful if you as a council can try and make it so people aren't forced to sell their land for this proposal, and that's just for the well-being of the community. They are hurting. I think you've heard from a few. Loss of Class 1 and 2 horticultural soils. The soils bordering the city are some of the most elite soils in New Zealand. These soils are in the same class as Pukekohe and Levin. The government proposed a national policy statement on the use of highly productive land to prevent the loss of more of our productive land and promote its sustainability management. To quote the Ministry of Primary Industries, our land is our taonga, an irreplaceable treasure and source of life and wellness for our country. Our economy depends on our land, our history and our culture are tied to it. We have a duty to cherish and protect it for future generations. However, our productive land is at risk. The proposed wastewater land will be lost to food production indefinitely, and that's a bit of a contradiction for a city that is trying to establish itself as a food hub. So just a few notes. Next slide, please. We note it appears Rangatani's preference is for option 2, and they do not support uptake of significant land areas. We're surprised it is proposed that the city's parks and sports grounds could be irrigated with wastewater either heavily treated or potable. We're not sure the public would want their recreational areas exposed to human wastewater and suspect it would account for very little water and wouldn't be cost effective. We suspect this is a PR distraction. We note the proposed recommendation on the agenda today doesn't mention the land area for discharge, yet the 75% discharge to land at low flows is linked throughout the BPO to 76 hectares. We hope the modelling doesn't change between now and the consent application and that the land area isn't increased. We note the weak language around excluding options 6 and 7, which are up to 2,000 hectares of land. and we hope these options aren't convertibly reinstated in the RMA application. We note the assumption that when the river is low, the discharge to land will be dry. We're not sure, but suspect the river flow can be low and the land still very wet, as the river flow isn't just influenced by the Manawatu weather. We note point 4.14, page 17 on the agenda today, refers to the Council accepting option 2 at the August 25th meeting, with a few other points. We weren't aware this was accepted, and its acceptance wasn't reflected in the meeting minutes, and we hope that point doesn't constrain you on your further decisions. So in summary, look, it just appears in the media and when I talk to everyone that land is seen as the panacea that will just fix this problem. Irrigation, wastewater irrigation to land is a difficult operation and will only work with the right soils and will only work if run well. And what is being proposed, even the 760 hectares, will be the biggest wastewater to land discharge in New Zealand. But we understand the complexity around this decision and the work with the technical team, the technical team has had to cover off to get to this point. But we are worried at not identifying the preferred land with soil type and with some inaccurate financial modelling of the wastewater discharge to land, it is not giving you all the information required for you to make your best decision. We're especially worried about the impacts these points will have on the cost of the proposal and maybe some of the other discounted options would have come close if the costs go up. The technical team are engaged and well paid to get a result. You're elected to make the best decision for the community, and we trust you keep questioning the technical team for the most accurate and up-to-date information to make the best decision. But we do support the proposed recommendation, if limited to 760 hectares as outlined in option 2. And the second point of the recommendation, we do support that if it doesn't include extra land over time. Thank you for your time today, and we really hope that we can still be included as a stakeholder with the further conversations. This is really tough on the rural community, and I hope you can just take that into account when you make your decision. Kia ora.
Thank you, Pete. I'm sorry about the technical issues there, but we got there in the end. Thank you. Are there any questions? Councillor Hapara.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Thanks, Pete. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Just wanted to know if you had a view on the adaptive management strategy.
So if you Google what adaptive management strategy is, it's a pretty wide open door that you do some modelling and you can come up with a reason, you can come up with a definition to do just about anything. So I think adaptive management is a wide open phrase commonly used in consultancy to basically do anything based on a model.
So what is your view of it in terms of the recommendation being put forward?
Well, I have no trouble with adaptive management if it's looking for proposals outside discharge to land. So adaptive management could refer to reverse osmosis, could refer to a lot of other technical abilities to make this, to cope with this problem over time. Look, it would be very easy for me to say that I don't support it because it could include land over time, but being honest, I think adaptive management for other processes is a good thing.
Thank you.
Councillor Hancock.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's hard to get the that right, so either too loud or not. Look, Peter, thanks very much for an update on your views. I just wonder if you could just perhaps comment in your slideshow. You said that cut and carry at best can net around $2,000, $2,000 per hectare. In terms of perhaps dairy and horticulture, can you give some idea of the financials around the gaps that we might see between cut and carry and its existing farming produce that we've currently have?
Right, that's a pretty wide question. So what my presentation said was cut and carry does not do $2,000 a hectare on my farm at the moment. It's more like $1,200 a hectare. And I'm saying under the proposal, taking out the major places you can sell it, it's likely to be considerably less than that. So your question then, I think, is what do other farming types net per hectare? Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Oh, look, I think under so much is dependent on the dairy price. I suspect under a high dairy price with your costs, so they may be around $1,500 a hectare. A dry stock farm like myself probably nets more like $1,000 a hectare. And look, those are indicative off the top of my head. I wouldn't. They were indicative at best.
Yes, so I suppose what you're saying is that between cut and carry and between dairy and perhaps dry stock, there is not a great deal of difference?
So you could ask businesses in Palmerston North, because they're all in the same place, is their income roughly the same? Different farms and different ownership models have widely different income levels. So what I'm saying is that a very well-run dry stock farm has a similar net return to dairy based on the cost of investment, etc. Which are way less than what is proposed under this scheme. I'm not sure that I'm exactly answering your question.
Yeah, I suppose we're getting to a point where I guess there's some ambiguity around that. So thank you very much. That's great. Thank you.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Peter, for presenting to us. Just a couple questions, if I might. The first one really stems from those maps. I found that quite helpful, seeing the contrast between the two maps on slide 5. And I guess really wanting to understand if we were working more in the scope of the left-hand map, which has the wider area signaled, what your comment would be on that approach at this stage of the process.
So our approach is that if you want to make this work, you've got to find the right land with the right soil type, and you've got to minimise it. We believe that the community should be consulted. You start reaching out to Sanson, I've got no doubt that they haven't been consulted. We believe this is going to be a problem for the community wherever that lies. And we have no preference for where it occurs, providing it's the right soil type and can minimise the effect on the community.
Great, thank you. And just in terms of clarifying your understanding of the map on the right-hand side, that's a potential scenario, not a confirmed scenario at this stage? Is that consistent with your understanding?
We have been presented with a number of maps, and if you look through all the documentation from the consultation through to the recommendation, there's numerous maps. I just happened to pull one up, I think it's on page 17, which suits the costing model, which is close to the city. And downhill, so you won't have to pump quite as much.
Great, thanks for that clarification. Finally, if I might, Mr. Mayor, is just to, I guess, compare where we've come from in terms of what we've heard from yourself and the Food and Fibre Group. I remember presentations to long-term plan and those sort of forums where at that point, as I understood it, the group was getting some of the benefits of actually coming out of the river in terms of, at that point, I think it was a potential more towards going towards the ocean and having the benefits of having a healthier river on the back of that. So just trying to really understand now that whether it's that you no longer see those benefits or that they're not weighing up properly against the issues that it creates for the rural community from your perspective.
Okay, so our earlier presentations, submissions were very clear. We felt the sea was the best long-term regional option. The sea has been taken off the table, and look, we get that. No issue with that. We believe that at low flows, there is some benefit for discharging to land. Now, I've run the numbers, and I've had a consultant who's done some work with wastewater discharge in this area, give me a quick heads up. If you run the numbers for taking significant amounts of land, you're still taking very little out of the river. So we believe that taking the wastewater out of the river at low flows is realistic. We believe in taking large land areas won't actually make a huge difference to what goes into the river and will just have a huge effect on the community. So I'm not sure if I've explained that properly. We're very wary throughout these documents. The percentages of these options change. Mm-hmm. I'm digressing slightly, but options 6 and 7, they don't talk about how much wastewater is taken out of the river. They say 40% of the time, 47% of the time, 53% of the time. They don't say 53% of the wastewater is being taken out of the river or 47% of the wastewater is being taken out of the river. They refer to times.
Yep.
And I note a lot of the information that was originally up around this consultation has been taken off the website, which talks about the cubic flows into the wastewater plant per day. But if you run those numbers and want to get 53% out of the river, I think you're looking at more like 10,000 hectares of land. So to answer your question, the reason we're supporting option 2 is it takes the wastewater out of the river at critical times when the river is low.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful further comment. Mr. Mayor.
Okay. Councillor Naylor, no more questions after that? Good. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Peter. I really appreciate you coming and speaking to us today. You've said that you accept that some discharge to land is necessary at low flows, but you've just acknowledged in your answer to Councillor Barrett that it's still taking a very little amount out of the river. That small amount that it's taking out of the river, do you believe that it's still worth the cost and the impact to those landowners to take that small amount out of the river?
My silence is me thinking. We sit here as a group supporting a proposal and a process. We would prefer no landowner to be affected, but this process isn't giving us that option. So we are supporting some discharge to land because it's better than some of the other options we've got in front of us.
Just to clarify, so your answer, am I correct to understand that you're accepting that option 1 is off the table?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That's helpful.
All right. Thank you, Peter.
And look, we really appreciate the opportunity to speak. We do acknowledge it's a hugely difficult problem and there's going to be losers out of this. And look, we just really want to continue to be considered as a sensible stakeholder that can come and talk to you and give rural views. Thank you.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
All right, councillors, to the main order of business today, which is our report.
Oh, look, I'm sorry. I'm getting out of order here. We have to accept the presentation from Peter Wells, Chair of the Food and Fibre Group. The Council resolves that the presentation from Peter Wells, Chair of the Food and Fibre Group, be received for information. I'll look to move that. Seconded by the Deputy Mayor. And are there any questions, comments before we vote? Right, we'll just vote with hands. All those in favour? And our friends online? They have as well. That's none against, no abstentions. That's passed unanimously. Thank you. Right, we now move to the main order of business, which is number 5. It's around the report around our BPO, approval of the best practicable option for Palmerston North's wastewater solution. So I invite the Chair of the BPO Project Steering Group, David Warburton, and our Chief Infrastructure Officer, Sarah Sinclair, that are both in person here to speak to that. But we also have online our Chief Engineer, Robert Van Bentum, and our Project Manager, Milena Voss, and our Technical Expert, Jim Bradley as well. So it's on page 9 of your papers, councillors. David, over to you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Can you hear me? No? Tēnā koutou katoa. I was just going to repeat what the Mayor said. For our safety, we have 3 of online. So we've got a presentation, brief presentation from David, but then when we get questions, we will direct them to the people online as necessary. Thank you. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and good morning, councillors. Thank you for the opportunity just to briefly introduce the discussion, not mine. What I'd like to do is really just summarise where we're at now to try and help the conversation. The proposal as it's put forward really has 3 components to it. The first component is the treatment system. And what we're proposing in the BPO is the highest level of treatment that we can achieve from a practical, the highest level that's currently being treated in New Zealand anywhere. And that's what we've loosely called level 4. This treatment will result in a liquid discharge that's effectively clear, it's effectively sterile, it's of the amount of nitrogen that's currently in the discharge levels from the treatment plant, and it will be a controlled operating system. So the treatment level is exceedingly good. There will be no ammonia in the discharge, so the whole toxicity issue has also been removed from the discharge with respect to the river and particularly fish life. The second component of the system that's being recommended is what I will call the discharge component. So after it's treated to the highest level practical in the country at this stage, the discharge will either go to the river via a wetland or to the land. And the decision as to which way it goes is largely dependent on the river flows and ensuring that there is never a discharge going into the river at low flows that negatively impact on the river and the river ecology. Fortunately, those times largely correspond with when we can apply it to the land because it's in the drier periods with the lower flows. There will be some buffering required, obviously, because it's not instantaneous, as Peter mentioned before. The land application, because we're dealing with a highly treated waste, is not similar to doing land application of a dairy shed effluent that you might be thinking of in terms of, remember, we are applying disinfected, clear, treated wastewater to the land. So it's largely a hydraulic loading criteria that we're using. The third component is what we've talked about in terms of adaptive management. Now, I think there's a little bit of confusion here. The adaptive management is not changing the criteria of compliance. The adaptive management is the responsible, smart way of applying the technology over time to accommodate the changes that will naturally and inevitably occur. For example, the design is broadly based around 50 years. So the adaptive management will take into account what needs to be done as there is growth. There's proposals to increase the recycling components within the system and potentially reuse various components of the treatment and the discharge. So as those become more suitable or improve, then the adaptive management will allow the discharge to change. And mention has been made, for example, of using it in irrigation within the city confines. There are examples over 50 years where natural replacement of the wastewater system will have some impacts on peak weather flows. You will recall that wet weather flows are 10 times roughly dry weather flows. So as you improve the network, those variations were likely to reduce. So the adaptive management will take that into account. Water usage per capita in the city is likely to come down over time. We are high compared to a lot of countries, a lot of cities around the world. So as we improve our utilisation of raw materials, it will consequently have an impact through. Adaptive management takes that into account. It in effect is no different to what you would do from an architectural point of view if you were designing a new building, saying we need to have flexibility in how we would use this building in the future. So you're building flexibility into the design. You're not compromising the design. So the adaptive management's the third part of the component. And the most important bit is that it allows progressive improvement in the design. So as we go forward over time, there will be improved criteria, changed criteria, improved technology. The adaptive management will allow this to be introduced to allow us to continue the improvement. And I suspect, as an example, we've already seen that the microfiltration being suggested couldn't have been done 5 to 10 years ago. It's viable now. The same will happen as we go forward. So those three components simply are like three legs of a chair. They need to be thought about together so that we actually optimise it. What happens from here? We take these three principles, these three areas, and we try and work through with our colleagues to get it to the point that's the next step in the process. Back to you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, David. That's a good high-level understanding of where we've come from. I have a couple of questions, and then I'll come to my colleagues. Everywhere I went, the highest level of treatment was mentioned everywhere, and it became even more of a number one issue for everybody as we went round. Could I understand what treatment, and maybe this is one to Jim, is the level of treatment that we're doing here is, if you imagine reversing the circular, back to drinking water, where are we at in the spectrum? Is it a 80% or is it a 70%? What is it?
We're one off drinking water, because reverse osmosis is the only component left in the treatment system that would take you through to drinking water. At this point in time, the reverse osmosis system is extremely expensive, and unless you were going to take it through to drinking water and have a whole resource cycle issue, you wouldn't do it. And there's only a few countries, e.g. Singapore, that have major water resource issues that are doing it on a formal basis.
But as you said, leaving flexibility in time, technology, costs come down, could a reverse osmosis plant be clipped on?
Absolutely. And if you start and think about climate change, in 50 years the city was a lot drier and water resources were a lot more challenging. The city may be faced in thinking about those as a requirement, as other places have to do. Australia's got enough where they're actually having to consider those things. And it may be a better option than desalinisation plants.
The report's a little bit absent on adaptive management approach, and you mentioned it yourself, that there was perhaps a lack of understanding on that. Could somebody give us an understanding of some examples? We've got a stormwater network which feeds into this, and there's infiltration like all cities, and Palmerston was no different. If that is improved, the flows that come into the wastewater plant can be significantly changed. Is that right?
Technically they could. It's quite hard to do because the network's so diverse. So that's probably one of the more challenging ones that I would think in reality. you would pick that up as you did your long-term maintenance over the 50 years. It's not something you'd go out tomorrow and do as a major. There are a range of adaptive management issues that you would do as you started to increased your recycling through the plant, as you changed where the applications might go for the wastewater. Those are things that you would increase and bring into the operation. Technology may change and you may be able to add something else onto the plant between your microfiltration and reverse. But the key issue is the adaptive management systems are what you are doing to take into account growth, how you manage trade wastes, what the key issues are, what the micro components might be, are the ones that you take into account as you're moving forward. The reason that we have introduced it is to make sure councillors understand that it's almost an inappropriate use of resources to build a plant for the requirements in 50 years' time today. What you need to do is build a plant today that can be adapted and modified to enable it to meet the 50-year requirement, and that's what the adaptive management is about.
Okay. And just finally, before I go to the Deputy Mayor, iwi, can somebody perhaps give us a little bit of a rundown on our engagement with Mana Whenua and River iwi?
Yes, Melena's the best to probably do that, but in summary, we've had ongoing meetings with Rangatani and Rakawa on a regular basis, and I think I'm at liberty to say Rangatani are supportive of the proposal as I've just talked about, with the river discharge using the highest possible treatment and recognising land application requirements when the river's not able to accommodate it. And the adaptive management is simply the wise application of technology over time as the city's requirements change.
Melena, do you want to comment further? We can't hear you.
No.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. Okay. So in working with iwi, Mana Whenua, we've had Rangi Tāne work with down-river iwi, including Mōtuku, Ngāti Aka. We've got Whakatere who are part of Raukawa, also independently working with us. And Raukawa have come along the journey and provided quite a substantial with their cultural values, which you've all read. The position collectively is that the best treatment is needed. Adaptive management provides the opportunity for council through robust consent conditions, through continuous monitoring of effects on the environment and the involvement of iwi as a partner to continuously improve the outcome over time through the life of the consent. Now, their position is focused on the highest treatment, which we've proposed within option 2, and also a key driver is to maintain the land area if option 2 is to progress with as close to Palmerston North as possible as a mitigation on other iwi. So, bring it into the rohi of Rangi Tāne helps mitigate the impacts on neighbouring iwi. So I just wanted to make those key points.
Water as a resource going in, and it's really important to bear that in mind. We're not in we're still in a flux environment there, and as demand comes down, the flows in will come down as well.
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I've got a couple of questions. I guess the first one is, in the report, the tone of the report, as highlighted by Mr. Wells, identifies that council have accepted a particular option, and going back through the minutes from the meeting where it's made reference to, there were two resolutions. The first was that we received the report. The second one was that we note, and obviously particularly the officer recommendations of scoring and weighting. There's been no acceptance, but that seems to form the basis of the tone of the report that we're receiving. Can I have a comment on that, please?
Through the chair, yes, I think that I fully take the point that you are raising. The BPO recommendation has come from the analysis that was done last time. So the BPO recommendation in the meeting, the councillors agreed not to change the weighting so that the recommendation would come to you as option 2. It's still absolutely fully in your purview to change that. And I apologise if we have misconstrued the wording around that. The intent was to communicate that the technical recommendation was tested at the last meeting, and that the weightings and modifications that led to option 2 being preferred were left to stand at the end of that meeting.
So when you say the council agreed on the weightings, is that based on the fact that there were some amendments tested around changing the weightings that failed, and so that's where you're taking the agreement from? Because even in the minutes, there's no recommendation that we agree, and so I'm just trying to understand the wording that's been used. If in 6 months, 12 months, 10 years' time, somebody went back to look at the minutes, how would they understand that you've noted in this report the council have agreed or accepted? Because that's not the resolutions.
No, valid point. And where I'm going is, I think it was taken as an assumption that option 2 would be presented by to council on the basis of the last meeting.
Okay.
As the preferred option.
Okay.
So, but I accept that the recommendation doesn't say that, but I think that's the assumption of that meeting, having tested the weightings that led to the recommendation of option 2 as a preferred option.
Okay. My next question is, there was, through the presentation from Mr. Wells, he talked about some of the figures of, his example was that, current farms are not making the 2K per hectare, and gave a more, or I guess his personal experience was that he was looking at around $1,200. And so I'm wondering, have the figures come from a national, is this a national figure, is this a local figure? Where is the data that's informing some of these figures coming from? Are they national averages or are they regional?
So Robert can give you some detail, but we use 2 separate consultants to provide us with some requirements for the land application and to verify the different numbers, the application rates and the management systems and the crops that can be used. And as Peter said, the actual numbers that you finally come up with will depend on your management system, your crop type and current state of the economy and a whole range of things. So there's a range of numbers in there that will be taken into account.
Yeah, I accept that. I guess I'm just wondering more if they were local, if they're provided based on...
It was both, because
okay.
the scale of the operation means that you will probably be selling and moving your feedstock to more than just the local farmer. Because of the scale of the operation, it will be a large operation.
Sure, okay, that makes sense. My next question is around the recommendation in our report. I guess my question is specific 5% diversion of wastewater when the river flow is below half median. So with some national data that NIWA have put out over the years addressing climate change, they've talked about the increasing rainfall and increasing intensity, I guess, of those events. So I'm wondering how that impacts the diversion when the 75% diversion is at low river flows, but if that scenario is happening less and less.
Not quite sure I understand your question, but climate change will have some effect on rainfall intensity and rainfall distribution. I think we can safely assume that that will have some impact on the peak river flows, the mean river flows, and the variation in river flow. The criteria that's been used here is to ensure that at the lower river flows, the level of treatment that we're doing does not impact on the periphytons and the river ecology. So those numbers, and this is part of where your adaptive management comes in, you will have to take that into account so that you can ensure that the river isn't impacted. And that's the detail that will come through in the consenting stage that sets, if you like, the absolute limits on what the river will need to achieve to ensure that they get what they want. We've assumed those calculations, and those are the approximate numbers based on current flows.
And so when you say that the numbers based on the current flows, has there been modelling done around what?
Yeah.
I guess that's what my question is.
So the modelling's done around the river flows and what the impact would be on the city's level 4 discharge on the river at a range of flows, and that's the recommended average to ensure that there isn't a problem, the 50% median flow.
Okay. Thank you. In terms of next steps, once this recommendation has passed, what's the role of the project management team in terms of lodging the consent and seeing that process through?
Chair, can you just explain what you mean by what's the role of the project management team?
So I guess we've had we've had a core team of experts who've kind of been involved in the BPO process so far, and so I'm wondering if that work continues, or whether the project management team was carrying us to the decision, or whether they carry us through to the judging, any appeals, that kind of stuff. I guess I'm acknowledging there's a huge amount of information and knowledge, and whether that's retained or whether it was about getting us to the point of making the decision as elected members.
So, through the chair, at the moment, Stantec's our procurement of Stantec is to the end of this stage. So, as officers, we are preparing procurement of the next stage, and we'll come to you in due course with a recommendation. That's probably all I can say about it at this stage.
No, that answers my question. I was just wondering around the process.
There's two parts to this. There's the part that Sarah's just said is who's going to do it and how the procurement's going to be. There's probably another part to your question, if I've guessed it right, Deputy Mayor, and that is we're going through a series of gates or sieves or drafting, and the decision that the council's been asked to make now is the next gateway in this process of narrowing it down. Mm-hmm. So to effectively get the best outcome, we want to narrow it down before we get to the real detail of the decision making, and you'll see that a whole range of people, depending on your point of view, says, I'd like a little bit more detail on where you're going to put the application. I'd like a little more detail on when it goes into the river. I'd like a little more detail on how you're going to treat this. as we've nailed it down to say, this is the envelope that we're pretty sure is going to give us the right answer, the next step is then to take that focused detail through to a consentable option. Who you choose to do that's what Sarah was talking about, but from here to 9 to 12 months is actually putting the blowtorch on that detail.
Yeah, thank you. That's a clear explanation. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Just on that, go to Councillor Harpiter. Mana Whenua would be involved in that process as well?
I can't control who
I keep switching the mic off. I'm going to stop doing to the chair. Obviously, Mana Whenua will be involved in the process. Exactly how is being resolved and developed at the moment.
Okay. I think under the RMA, I think they sort of have to be, don't they, legally? Yeah. I was hoping for that answer. Councillor Harpiter.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Thank you, Sarah and David. Just looking at 4.12 in the document. So Peter brought this up, and it talks about options when soil is deficient of water. Over the last week, we've seen soil that's been very moisture, lots of moisture. So, and our water for the river comes from Tararua, so we don't kind of have a lot of say of what happens when it does come from the Tararua. So I just wanted to really just ask the question around, we're not moisture deficient, so I just wanted to really just get an opinion on 4.12 of where you're going with that comment in 4.12.
So from a technical point of view, there are periods of the year when we are moisture deficient by definition. There are also periods of the year when the land could accommodate more moisture even if it's not significantly deficient. And you only need to have a look at the number of irrigation schemes that are through the Manawatu now where there's been significant investment to ensure production through the dry periods. The second issue that Peter did mention, and we agree with him, is that there is a slight buffer period between the river flows or the rain events and the ability to apply it to the land. So there will be storage capacity within the system, so you don't have to irrigate the day after it rains, for example. You've got time for that water to drain away. The second thing, of course, from a broad point of view, given the buffer, is that when the river flows are low, the land generally can benefit for some land. When the river flows are high, the land generally doesn't need the water because it's already rained, and the river's capable of accommodating the flow from the wastewater plant.
Okay. 4.14 does refer to parks and golf courses. So I just want to know what you are referring to when you are talking about parks and golf courses in our city.
That's simply just part of what we referred to broadly as the adaptive management systems. This is an application that may be deemed to be appropriate once the treatment plant's in. We've established that it's clear, it's odourless, it's sterile, and it's actually not a health hazard. Once you've got the trials, you can use underground irrigation, for example, on the golf courses, so there's no spray or drift, and you could effectively use portions of the water and the nutrients that remain in it to maintain freeways, etc.
So it's sprayed across the golf courses?
You don't need to spray it. You can do underground irrigation as well, so there's no aerosols and drift. It would be a case of how you just chose to apply that. You can design irrigation systems so they're all diffused from underground.
Okay. My next question goes to the cost of adaptive management. Have you put a price tag on this?
Well, no, because we don't know exactly what it is. The answer to that is that it's cheaper than not having adaptive management, because you'd actually end up trying to design everything for 50 years today and writing a check out for it, and it was likely to be wrong.
But you're asking us to sign something off today when we don't know what the cost of it is. So
No.
how can we do that without knowing what a cost of it is?
What we're asking you to do today is to agree to something that meets all the requirements for today and has the flexibility to allow things to be added and changed in the future as events change, because none of us, with all due respect, have total clarity as to what the requirements are going to be in 50 years' time in terms of water use, technology, environment, etc. So the adaptive management is simply to say we recognise that there will be things that will need to change over 50 years. Are we designing into the plant the flexibility to be able to manage that?
Is there any...
And provide progressive, continuous improvement as conditions change and technology allows it.
Thank you, David. Is there any educated guess of how much it will cost for the future?
I can't give it to you off the top of my head now, but I would say, to be honest, no adaptive management will be more expensive on day one than adaptive management, because you'll be trying to build today what you need in 50 years' time. With the city hasn't, you've got 50 years of growth, you're going to fund it today? I doubt
it. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and thank you, David and Sarah. I've got a few questions, if that's okay. In the long report that was provided to us for the 25th of August meeting, in the detail around each option, in the detail around option 2 on page 30 in section J, it talked about staging possibilities. It talked about MBR trains doing some now, some later. It talked about perhaps not using all the land straight off, but using some now and some later. If council adopts option 2 today, is the assumption that the staging possibilities would be a part of that, or would there need to be further direction around, or when would it be decided whether there'd be that implementation of option 1 would be staged, or whether it would be all at once? And also, if it was staged, over what period of time would that be implemented?
So I think two things to answer that. The first is that's what gets done as part of the detail from here to consenting, because you won't get a consent without having some of that detail. There's no point spending money on that detail if this wasn't going to be the option that you were going to choose, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So it's part of what needs to be done between here and getting a consent. And that also allows you to do two things. One, it allows you to work through the delivery program in terms of what gets built now, what gets built later as you've got the progression. It also allows you then to design in where the flexible points are as part of that adaptive management. What might change with the new regulator, what might change with the environment, what might change with the technology shift. Those are built in as we move forward, and there are checkpoints in that.
Okay. Can you give us a ballpark? Like, are we talking 2 years or 5 years or 10 years? I mean, what?
My guess is you'll be working on 3 to 5 year cycles,
Okay.
because that's sort of typically your design build cycles, 3 years. So your LTP cycle in terms of approving processes, you'll be working 5 to 30 years in terms of your resource consent processes, unless the new RMA changes that.
Okay, thank you. In terms of the adaptive management, Councillor Harpert has already asked some questions around the cost of that. I guess what I would be interested to understand is, I think a lot, obviously makes a lot of sense to have some flexibility to be able to respond to updated technology. If we were to include adaptive management, would the potential for those updated technologies replace the strategies that are already in option 1, or be on top of, add to them?
They would probably add to them if there was something new that we didn't know about, or they would modify them, thinking really about option 2 rather than 1, because we've got the land component as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so if there were costs that related to the 496 million in option 2, that new technology found a better way of doing it,
Yep.
are you suggesting that we would still have to progress that if it was an option 2 as well as...
No, the adaptive management would basically say this is a better way to do it if
Okay.
something came up. That's why I suggested to you, using sort of my general sort of high-level terms, there's 3 components to this. There's a treatment component, there's a discharge component, and there's a management component in terms of how you do that to optimise the outcome from a social, financial, environmental point of view without compromising the standards that we set.
Okay, thank you. So in terms of the recommendations in the report that we have in front of us, the second recommendation, committing to continue to explore practicable options to further reduce discharge to the river, is that different to the adaptive management, or is that the same as?
Pretty much the same. The adaptive management, current jargon for having the flexibility to ensure you're optimising what needs to be done at the appropriate time.
Okay, and if Council was to respond to the feedback given from Peter Wells today and consider a cap of 760 hectares of land, would that cap be able to also be applied to any adaptive management or any exploration of other practicable options?
In principle, yes. My suggestion would be, you've noted Peter's comments. I would suggest Council and your advisors will not be buying any more land than is needed to actually achieve a satisfactory outcome. Capping it by default doesn't. Capping it means that it's not a target, and if you had to go over it, you'd have to come back to Council if there was a technical reason to go over it if you capped it. But the reality is you're never going to go there if you don't have to. I think it's important to realise the irrigation scheme's about optimising production. We're not talking about a landfill and destroying the soil, the land and everything else. It's actually utilising it.
Okay. Just a few more, if that's all right, Mr Mayor. In terms of the 3 components you explained earlier, and the first one being the treatment, and you talked about the exceedingly good quality of water that is produced following the treatment, that you've talked about being clear and sterile with no ammonia, no toxicity, and that there'll be no health hazard to anywhere it's supplied to, and that it's the highest level in the country. Some people have suggested that putting this water into the river would actually improve the quality of the river. Would that be a correct statement?
Depending on what criteria you're measuring. So, if the river's full of silt because of a flood event and you're measuring suspended solids, the answer is absolutely, because it's just come out of a microfiltration plant. So it depends what you're measuring. If it's just the plant's gone through a UV sterilisation, so its bug count level will be lower than the river if there happens to be, a dead animal upriver and it's affecting the water quality through natural events. So it all depends what you're measuring. I think those statements are sometimes emotive, and from a science and engineering point of view, you just look at the numbers and say what you're going to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the second recommendation makes an assumption that we continue to look at options to further reduce discharge to the river. Can we progress adaptive management strategies without that assumption?
Well, that's adaptive management is actually always saying, how can we make this better?
Yeah.
I think my comment when I was introducing it saying adaptive management is the most responsible way to ensure that we're meeting all our environmental, social and fiscal targets in the most efficient way available to us at the time.
Okay. On page 11 of the report...
Sorry, Councillor, I'll just,
Yep.
we'll come back to you.
2 more.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll now go to Councillor Barrett. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, David, for the report and the team online. Just a couple questions. The first is just clarify with option 2 that we're still seeing discharge to the river every day of the year.
I think that would there could be some discharge to the river every day of the year, because if it's going through a wetland or something like that, before it gets to the river, there will be buffer in the system. So even if it's predominantly diverted to land on any particular time, there'll be residual flows going through the system. But they will be substantially less than the normal wastewater flows.
But in terms of the commitment that's there is around 75% removal, so there's still the option for up to 25% in any day to still be traveling through to the river.
I think the statement there was that it wouldn't be more than that. So there may be well less than that. But yeah.
Right, thank you. The second is just to understand where we were a couple weeks ago, which in those papers referred to the potential success of adaptive management in terms of achieving levels of diversion consistent over time with options 6 and 7. And there's now in the current report no reference to sort of where we might get to in terms of adaptive management over time with increasing diversion. Can I just understand, I guess, what was intended 2 weeks ago with the report and what has changed coming into this report that we now don't see reference to those levels of diversion?
Well, I think the adaptive management was predominantly, say, you would use the land areas that were necessary to achieve the outcomes that were required at the time. At the moment, we don't see that that would need to be in excess of 700 to 800 hectares. But if conditions changed, the city was substantially greater, environmental conditions changed, rules and regulations changed, you may have to adapt to taking more land area, and so you'd have to think about that from a practical point of view. But right now, we can't see that, but you would think so that you had the capability to do that.
So can I take from that that there is still the potential of achieving those levels of diversion?
If we have
it's not guaranteed, but that there is a potential.
Correct.
Right,
you wouldn't want to lose the flexibility to have that as an option going forward, and that's part of where the design would be saying, if this changed, could we accommodate it, and how would we do that?
Thank you. And finally, Councillor Naylor touched on the option around capping at this stage in the process at a specific number of hectares. I guess, can you just give us a bit of perspective in terms of the risks at this stage in the process of putting in a hard cap around number of hectares?
I don't think it's a big risk, because we've done some assessments on that. I think it might give councillors comfort, but I don't think it's probably ideal, because it means between here and final consenting, if the refined designs came up with a slightly different number, we may have to come back to council and say we'd like it changed. Whereas what we're really trying to say is we want to achieve the desired outcome, and we think it's around 760 hectares. If you put a hard line on it and it becomes 820, we've actually got to come back to council. So I would say, from a practical point of view, if council accepts the process, the science and the intent of what we're trying to do, then you probably don't need to actually put the cap on it. You know what the general indication is. And from a management point of view, if it was substantially different, you'd be coming back to council to brief them anyway, if something cropped up. So that would be how I would see it personally.
Great, thank you. Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. A couple of mine have been asked. First question is around 4.3 in the report, where it refers to RMA planning, but I actually think that it should be referring to Maori values and MCA. Can you confirm that?
I might need to get Milena to actually...
So it's the second bullet point.
Yep.
Where it talks about the RMA planning assessment. I think that should actually read Maori values and MCA.
Yes, sorry, through the chair, that is a typo. The third one is the RMA.
Okay, thanks for confirming that. That's what I thought. So my question's around freshwater standards, which over the course of the consent that we have at the moment have improved considerably, I suppose, and are likely to continue to become more stringent, I think, as time goes on. Can you comment on how this proposed option would be adaptable enough to meet those increased standards over time?
Yes, two ways, just simply. One ultimately would be that you would, if you were going to continue to put it into the river and it was an essential criteria that the river standards were of that level, you would have to go to reverse osmosis or whatever became the next level of treatment beyond the microfiltration and UV that we're doing now or proposing to do now. So that's option one. And option two is that probably where Brett was going earlier, you would end up diverting a higher percentage to land because of whatever the criteria was that was not allowing you to put it into the river. And that would then have to be the land management to ensure that you didn't, in protecting the river, damage the land, because what we're not trying to do is actually create a wasteland. We're trying to actually utilise the nutrient and the water to get some recovery.
Yeah, absolutely. So if the standards increase and we end up diverting a higher percentage to land, how would that be accounted for in the current consent if we had specified that we were just doing option 2, the limited amount to land at low flows? Would we need to go back for another consent?
That's probably more of an RMA legal question. My guess going forward, if you want to hypothesise, is that future consents are going to have more regular reviews and updates under the new water regulator than the historic consenting process has had. And you can see the significant changes, for example, between the criteria when we got our last consent and what needs to be done on this consent. And I suggest that under the current scenarios of the water reform, they will be looking at more regular and smaller incremental changes as part of the freshwater improvement program.
Okay.
Milena might have something to add to this on the RMA side as well. So,
yeah. Do you want to add anything, Milena? Can't hear you or see you.
Yes, no, somebody reply.
Okay.
Thank you. The adaptive management we're talking, in the context of our current options, it is applied in a robust way in terms of consent conditions, and I think we've talked about this previously. What we consented in 2006 and what we have now and what we want to look for through to the future. We don't want to be stuck with 2022, technology and solution, and watch, standards in freshwater and also soil come into play, which are going to become more stringent over time. So by implementing consent allows council to review the environmental effects of what we approve today over time. We can bring in enhancements through the consent process and conditions. So if we do get to a point over time where the land is maxed out, which we've proposed for 50-year horizon here, 740 hectares, but we adopt it. There's other mechanisms to go through, not necessarily entirely new consent. It could be a change of conditions, but it can be written into the consent condition when we go through this first process to ensure that it is streamlined for this council to continue to adapt to environmental conditions and changing legislative requirements. in a streamlined way. So just wanted to add that too in terms of context for the Resource Management Act.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr.
Just before I go back to Councillor Naylor, and perhaps a question through you, David, to Jim. Regular, and this is following on from Councillor Johnson's question, regular reviews and adaptive management are pretty well part of today's consenting system, aren't they?
In brief, yes, but Jim may want to comment because he's got some practical skin in the game in a couple of other jurisdictions. Jim?
Are you hearing me okay?
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And building on many of the comments that have been made on current consenting under the RMA and the way it evolves over time and will continue to do as we have. What we have, and I've been deeply involved in a number around New Zealand, particularly of major wastewater consents, that long duration periods have been given in the consents, mostly that maximum 35 years. One of the first was Wellington City's main plant, Moa Point, where a periodic review of technology, of environmental standards, of growth, of monitoring, of particularly technology was put in place, and that regular review looks at things and comes up with changes that should be made. The question is about will they be made? That was an early one. Very briefly, I'm just going to touch on four. Firstly, Whanganui, Whangarei, too many Whanganuis and Whangareis. Whangarei's Ruakaka Marsden Point consent. It has a very rigorous 7-year review of growth, because there's huge growth projected there, of technology, of whether it's discharging to land or, in that case, to water, namely the ocean, of what new reuse technologies around. In fact, right at the moment, I'm involved in that review. So the basis of that review, driven very much by environment and changing things, is what goes forward to the regional council and is considered, and best practical options are built into it, and the local iwi are involved and others. The second one, and this is very much a kind of governance one, is Hastings wastewater consent. 35 years was granted, but with 9 yearly very rigorous reviews. And one of the things in the consent for Hastings is that a joint committee of Tamaki Whenua and Council under the Local Government Act has a very large involvement in that throughout the life of the 35-year consent. The third project, very briefly, is a pretty recent one, Watercare's Pukekawi, a consent discharge with a fairly advanced treated wastewater. Not quite as far as proposed in our level 4 for option 2. That has regular reviews that the regional council are involved in, and in these reviews, trigger levels or dates when certain things shall be done. And the last one I'll mention is Hamilton City's water take from the Waikato River. In that case, we have what is called a step consent. So as Hamilton City grows, requires more water, when it reaches a certain step or level, implements a whole range of water conservation measures to be assessed, etc. The thing and the message that we are having here, and I've heard coming through today well, is that we need rigour in the consent conditions, that these reviews, the things that are happening now, are enshrined in an adaptive management approach, so actual things happen and not are just reviewed. So that's giving a wee window on 4-5 different cases, but there are a number of others. And as I started saying, in the terms of getting a long-term consent, these reviews are almost a common practice, and now it's just building it into an adaptive management action, so there's robustness there. I hope that's helped, councillors.
And through the chair, if I could just add, obviously Horizons will be setting the consent conditions, but we will be working with them on making sure that they, we'll be working with them on making sure that there are things that work well.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just a couple of further questions related to cost. On page 11 and 2.5 of the report, it outlines the project objectives, and the 7th objective is that it's affordable and cost effective. In our long-term plan, we've allowed $350 million for this project, and our staff, as well as the auditors, have acknowledged that even that amount is not actually fundable. And I think the view at the time was that perhaps that burden would be passed on to the Three Waters entity. With the uncertainty around the Three Waters entity, I guess the two questions are, do you believe that that objective has been met through the suggested recommendations today? And if so, what consideration has been given to how option 2 would be funded?
Stuart should answer the second one.
Great question. I guess I see Stuart coming up to answer a question. Can I just say, I think the first principle that we've used all the way through here is what's the right answer for the environment, for the city, and not just for now, but for going forward to improve it. And the second question then is, if we do that in the most responsible way we can and come up with the lowest number, having met that standard, how then do we fund it? And that's the process that we've gone through. We haven't gone the other way around and say, what are we going to end up with if we've only got X dollars? So my own view now is if we know that it's X, whether it's 360 million or 460 million, at that point we have to sit down and have a conversation as to how we're going to fund it and how we're going to finance it, because there's two components of that. And that may involve Crown money, it may involve some form of alliance partnership, it may involve a whole range of things. But I'll hand it back to Stuart if he wants to make some more comment within the LTP.
Only that, excellent answer from David, only that under current conditions and our current financial strategy, we can't afford it. That's as simple as that. And David quite rightly pointed out that we'll have to come up with something in due course should this be the correct decision.
Can I just say one of the reasons, as I understand it, for the new water service entities is that they, by definition, will effectively be utility companies in a global sense of the word. And they will then have a balance sheet debt equity ratio capability that is more in line with utilities as opposed to the debt equity rates relationship that is mandated under the Local Government Act that TLAs have to work in. So the ability to have debt on the balance sheet will be greater with a water service entity. So what notionally is affordable against balance sheet will be greater with a utility than with a TLA. And that's part of the rationale for this. It still needs to be funded and financed, but the ability to do it will be different.
So am I taking from your answer that you're saying that it would only be possible through if we do actually go with Three Waters option?
No, what I'm saying is if it went to the Three Waters option, they could probably handle it in a different way. They could just potentially say we can do it through a debt arrangement over a long period of time because they'll be able to carry it on a balance sheet, whereas the TLA couldn't. The TLA would need to sit down and go to the Crown and ask the Crown how they would handle it or come up with some arrangement that met with the TLA's fiscal requirements, that New Zealand Audit were happy with it, etc.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just along the lines of Councillor Naylor, just around its affordability on the city's books and having the water entity transfer being not as certain as it may have seemed previously. Is there other mechanisms the city can consider around transferring water into its own CCO? Is that a possibility that's realistic?
So the answer is technically yes, because the water care this scenario is effectively a CCO in Auckland. However, because it's a CCO, it still gets constrained by the council's balance sheet because they all get consolidated from a treasury point of view. So you can have a CCO, but by definition, which is, to be honest, one of the reasons why, we're getting off track here slightly, why the water services, water reforms are saying it won't be a CCO, because it doesn't allow you to get out of the TLA fiscal umbrella.
Yep.
So you go to a utilities as a Crown entity, it will remove the ability to privatise, but it allows the ability to have a different debt ratio, equity ratio.
Okay, thank you. Yep. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Oh, Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, David. David, the option 2, got quite a big land footprint, which is the biggest any council in New Zealand's done, so there's risks around that. So can you just outline sort of some of the key risks of us? I'm sort of worried, like if we go into staging further out, what are the risks out there of going to so much land?
I think as the land area increases, it becomes significantly more problematic just in terms of management, land area, social impact, etc. So I would like to think that technology reducing our waste flows per capita, water use per capita, reuse options would actually mitigate in a more responsible way than just taking more and more land to dispose of it. So if you like, the slope of the curve gets quite steep as you get to the bigger land areas, and so the benefits of recycling and alternate front-end mitigation becomes more and more affordable because of the costs at the other end.
Yeah, because one of the concerns is, like, we've done some visits around some of the other TAs and, Rotorua, they discharged to land and there was issues that they didn't know about, and even some of the smaller TAs. So how do we overcome?
I think we've got some of the advantages from learning from them. Always best not to be first, if that makes sense. I think the other thing is that some of our designs are conservative, so I think there's buffers in the design. So we have taken a view that ensures that we have some capability and some flexibility. It's a case, if we had to go beyond the 700 plus hectares, then it does become a challenge. It's a big operation by any means.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, Councillor Hancock.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks, David. I guess probably just going on a little bit from sort of some of the questions which have been put forward so far, and I'm possibly you've probably seen the spreadsheet which I produced, which was subject of a councillor query. Over time, if we went to option 6, which of course is the 2,000 hectares, so on today's rate, it would be approximately $169 million more than the NPV for option 2.
Option 6 is a very expensive option. To be honest, even if you ignore the money, managing 2,000 hectares on a cut and carry from a farming I think what we're really saying is that is the outlier in terms of the land area option, and why we didn't recommend it as the here's the option, just to keep it out of the river and keep putting it on the land if you like. It is problematic. Option 1 is the other extreme, we're putting it all on the river, and it's got problematic from other points of view. It may be more confined and more able to be documented from a cost and delivery point of view, but it has its own challenges from river ecology and culture. So the different options have different challenges that we've got to match, which I guess is why we're sitting around the table to try and find the BPO.
Great, thank you. That's been very helpful. Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
All right, councillors. I think we've exhausted the questions, and thank you to David and to Sarah. We will break now, councillors. So we'll be back in here at 11:05, and then we'll go through the recommendations and any amendments from there. Thank you. Kia ora tātou, welcome back everybody. Right, we have now the recommendations to the BPO option for Palmerston North Wastewater Solution. We have two recommendations there, but before we go to that, we have a number of amendments first. So the order that I'll take them in, depending on where everything goes, is I'll come to you, Councillor Barrett, first, and then whatever happens there, then to you, Councillor Hancock, and then I have two in there as well. If for whatever reason we need to go back to the substantives, we will thereafter. So I'll now, if we could just get the amendment up, please.
Sorry, just a point of order, Mr. Mayor. We need a motion up to be able to move an amendment.
I'm getting people talking at once, sorry.
Sorry, so in terms, we can't move an amendment because we don't have a recommendation up, so I understand that you'll need to move maybe the officer's recommendations, and then Councillor Barrett will move an amendment to that.
Okay. All right. Well, look, I'm quite happy to move number one, and I have a seconder for that, and then we'll go to the amendment. I've got number one there. Is there a seconder for that? Hey, thank you, Councillor Johnson. We need to get a starting point, people. All right. I will now go to the amendment, please. Councillor Barrett. Okay, so we have an amendment there from Councillor Barrett and seconded by the Deputy Mayor that the Council adopts as the best practical option for managing wastewater from Palmerston North for the next 50 years, option 2, with the highest practicable treatment, level 4, and a minimum of 75% diversion of wastewater from the river when the river flow is below half median, including a staged approach within the first 35 years to achieving the 53% level of diversion indicated in option 6. Councillor Barrett, I'll leave you to speak to that.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, colleagues. We are well down the track now in terms of this process and to the point of beginning to better define what is needed for the good of the community as well as for the good of the river. The reason that I bring this amendment and the reason that it's explicit about the level of diversion and not about a unit of land is because 2 weeks ago when we had papers in front of us, those papers began to set a direction of travel, and that was starting with option 2, but over the life of the project, and it is an intergenerational life of that project, to build up to the level of diversion signaled in options 6 and 7, somewhere around the 50% mark. So at that stage, it was all good. In fact, you will recall we were all virtually meeting, obviously, but I spoke in favor of the recommendation 2 weeks ago because that actually sat well in terms of landing where we had gotten to in a multi-year process from hearing from multiple stakeholders in the community, including the farming community, and taking best inputs of the technical advice that we're broadly accepting of, et cetera. So I was quite comfortable 2 weeks ago with that, but was concerned in seeing the papers today that are now silent about the amendment looks to uphold where we were 2 weeks ago, and to clarify that, as we've heard from our advisory team this morning, option 6 levels of diversion are within the range of what can be achieved, principally with technology and water conservation, and that's very much the direction of travel here. So I'd ask you to support this in terms of good working. I was with the project steering group from pretty much day one. I'm there for 4 years now. We've spent several millions of dollars to get to this point, and have heard of from hundreds of people in our community about their concerns, not just about what might happen in the rural communities, but also concern about the health of the river and a very clear signal about protection of the environment over time. So again, this recommendation and as amended brings us back to actually the best option of us. It well balances the voices that we've heard from the wider community, from affected communities downstream, from iwi, etc. It does deliver us a healthier river and over time continues to see improvements. Again, option 2 alone sees wastewater into the river still every day of the year. This gives us a way forward that eventually we start to see some days where wastewater is no longer going to the river. And it's also our best chance for a consent that will stand the test of time. So I'd ask you to support it on the basis of that rationale, that we do see clear benefits here and this can deliver those benefits over time in an adaptive way. This is very much the best way forward for the river and for our people. Mr. Mayor.
Are there any others that want to speak to this? All right. Look, I'll approach this. I just, first of all, Councillor, on hearing the advice of officers and today, you don't want to change anything here?
No, I'm comfortable with what's there.
Okay, all right. Okay, councillors, I can't support this at all, and I feel somewhat sitting with people in the room for 4 years, and at the 11th hour, we hear advice not to do this, and we're attempting to do it at the 11th hour. Ring fencing, and that's why I did ask the councillor whether we wanted to change it. Ring fencing the measurements on percentages in today's flows, I think is very dangerous for our children, for our grandchildren, and future ratepayers and residents. It goes against the technical advice. It goes against iwi's advice to us, to having flexibility. And I can understand the councillor and perhaps the deputy mayor seeking some more clarity, and I too was disappointed that there wasn't more clarity in the paper. It was almost like the former paper was actually more prescriptive on what adaptive management would be. And we have tried to tease out with our questioning, what adaptive management is. In Japanese terms, it's called kaizen. It's continuous improvement. And you just can't get a consent with, and again, I think that was teased out with the expert advice. You just cannot get a consent without continuous improvement, without iwi involvement, of course, with waters. I think ring fencing ourselves to option 6 and this level of diversion is dangerous. It is dangerous. Our BPO group got advice, and it wasn't this. So I struggle with this because this is a huge decision for us, absolutely huge. We've heard today, and you know we may not be here as this consent process goes through in the future. There may be other. We're only the occupiers of the seats for a few times. Maybe a set of councillors wants extra land. So we've just heard today how our class 1 and 2 soils are at risk. So in today's limited opportunities, I think for diversion here, we need to keep the flexibility open, absolutely. And also keeping it as close to our rohi, as close to Palmerston North as possible, and within Rangatane's footprint. So again, I do think this, I can understand why it is up, but it actually is such a big call. I'd ask you not to, it's just going too far, too quickly, and I believe we're going to get there with the adaptive management, and I just signal that I have an amendment around that and a further recommendation that will see this come on board, but without it ring-fenced around option 6 and today's percentage levels. And we got advice that you shouldn't be doing that. So I strongly advise you not to to vote this through, please. Right, to the Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I am very proud to second this amendment. I guess what I see today as the recommendations is only a piece of what I understood the direction that we were setting or acknowledging 2 weeks ago. 35 years is a long time. It's longer than I've been alive. If you have been alive longer than 35 years and you think back to what was happening in our community 35 years ago, decisions that were being made, we would probably think we would never make those kind of decisions today. I can't commit to option 2 full stop. I can absolutely commit to aspects of option 2 and option 2 with firm pathways. And I think that we have an opportunity to ensure that we can commit to those further pathways with our vote today by ensuring progress is included in a recommendation. If we don't set firm targets, in 35 years, are we going to look back and be proud of the steps the city has made? Are we going to look back and see tangible progress? Because I think without setting firm targets, then this is a dangerous risk to take. We've put so much investment and effort into restoring the Mauri of the river as a city, turning our focus back towards the river, creating our river framework. You know, there's been so much that we as a council have put into that, and we have an opportunity to really enhance the mana of the decisions that we've set, the framework that we've set. I think, you know, the decisions that we're making today, they're not just about numbers and they're not just about balance sheets. They're about being kaitiaki, guardians, protectors of the land that we are living on. And decisions that we make can't just have acknowledgement of efforts or research, investigations. We have to see a clear pathway forward, and that includes setting some targets. And so I would ask you that you would support this amendment. We have an opportunity, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for most of us here to actually make a difference around getting wastewater pumped into that river daily that we are putting so many other efforts around to try and address and lift up. And I genuinely think that if we are not setting targets, there is absolutely no commitment to actually seeing progress in that space. So I'd urge you all to support this amendment.
Councillor Hancock.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I've also signalled that I've got an alternate amendment should this one fail, and that would be to restrict us to 760 hectares. If I could just ask the administrators, I actually have got a map which I've sent through earlier. Perhaps that can be just put up on the screen for councillors to have a look at.
Point of order, Mr. Mayor. We're talking to the amendment at the moment. I think Councillor Hancock could wait to talk to his amendment till it comes up.
Yeah, we can put your map up when we're speaking to your one.
Okay. Well, I'll start off in terms of just perhaps just saying that I certainly won't support this. The land area which is actually being inferred through the amendment there, which actually specifies option 6, is 2,000 hectares. Now, the 760 hectare option, which is part of option 2, if I can describe that to you, is if we go to the square, and we walk down Fitzherbert Ave all the way to the Fitzherbert Bridge, and then you take a walk 4 kilometres west of the city out to Rongatea Longburn Road, come back to the main road, and then come back to the square. That is what 760 hectares looks like. 2,000 hectares is everything on the urban footprint of Palmerston North. It's a massive piece of land. Imagine trying to fit that into the city boundary. We've got Pressures, Kiwi Rail Hub to the north of the city. We've got residential developments to the east of the city at Tamakuku, Ashurst. And to the south and west of the city, we've got plans for Kekewhenua and Kakatangiata developments. So there is absolute real pressure in terms of land acquisition. In terms of Māori interests, I can't speak for Māori, I can't speak on behalf of Māori, but I can speak in support of their kaupapa. What are the things which are important to them? And if we go back through the papers that were presented to us, if we look at mana whenua, rangitane, their interests were highest treatment for any option used, direct discharge to any water body 100% of the time is not supported. However, what they've said is that they will actually concede that adaptive management is a means to actually remove us out of the river over time. Discharge to land outside the Palmerston North boundary is not supported. Large areas of land acquired for this purpose is not supported. And discharge of wastewater near Opeki is also not supported. In terms of Ngāti Raukawa, the hapu, their preference is no discharge to a water body, discharge to land must be within the city boundary, and the highest level of treatment is what is preferred. We've all been lobbied by the rural sector. Those that live in the potential receiving environments do have a major stake in the choices that we make today. The lobbying by the rural sector is a fundamental right under the democratic process, so we must listen to them and take that into account. Those that live west of the city are for certain to be their lands are likely to be considered either whole or in part as part of the receiving environment. Our city is dependent on the rural sector. Palmerston North grew out of servicing the rural rural population. So we must be mindful of the financial impacts on those that produce on our behalf. In terms of the RMA, among other things, the RMA must be cognizant of the effects on people and communities. And that just is not constrained to the people that live within our boundaries. That is also those people that live in the receiving environments. I've mentioned cost, and cost came up in terms of the conversations with David a little bit earlier on. And there is a concession that if we actually went through a process acquiring 200 hectares of land, that the additional cost over and above option 2, the NPV for option 2, is about $169 million. And that's in today's money.
Councillor, can I get you to wrap it up?
Yes, I will, thank you. And those additional costs are in terms of extra land purchase, conveyance, water application infrastructure, and also enhancing of wetland. Make us find the most receptive soils. Those are my submissions. I won't support it.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I also will not be supporting this amendment. I think in questioning, I think it was Councillor Barrett that asked the question of David Warburton earlier around option 6. David made it clear that not only was it an extremely expensive option, but there were also issues around delivery of the model of cut and carry over that quantity of land, up to 2,000 hectares of land. I think we need to listen to the expert advice that's given to us and take heed. Not only the expert advice outlined those concerns to us, but we've heard from numerous landowners about the impact that it would potentially have on them for us to interfere with their livelihoods for generations. So these are people who've had generations of their families living on land. We need to try and step inside of their shoes for a moment and imagine what it might be like for this city to come and take their land in order to increase the percentage of water discharge deferred from the river. This is water that is exceedingly good quality, effectively clear and sterile, with no ammonia and no toxicity. So I think we're looking at this ideal with a bit of a lack of balance. Peter Wells, in his submission to us this morning, asked us to cap the land use for 3 reasons: for cost, community, and the environment. I don't have to spell out each one of those. I think it's clear to us. The reports on option 6 outline $135 million just for land purchase for up to 2,000 hectares. And Councillor Hancock has outlined some of the other additional costs. This process has been a really robust process. The project objectives, there are 11 objectives, and I think for the most part those have been met through this process. Objective 7, I do not believe has been met through this process, and I don't think adequate consideration of affordability or cost effectiveness has been applied to this process. And I also believe that the social impact to landowners has been underestimated in the reporting, and I think as elected members we need to give serious consideration to that. I agree with the concept of us needing to be able to flex, but my view at this point is that we should be flexing down the amount of land that we're hoping to have to use. If we're going to perhaps endorse option 2 today, I would prefer it that we were able to use less land than 760 hectares. I'm certainly happy to support the amendment that Councillor Hancock will put forward to cap that, and the risk around that, the only risk around that is that potentially down the track, if experts determined that we needed more, that would have to come back to this table for another decision. I don't think that's a risk at all. I think it's appropriate that when land is needed, if land is needed, that significantly will impact on landowners in our area, that it should come back to this table for a decision. So I'll be opposing this amendment and will be supporting any amendment that actually puts better restrictions around the use of large quantities of land.
Councillor Finlay, online.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I presume you can hear me?
Yes.
Thank you.
Councillor Dingwell online.
Sort of starts to come into it. This amendment here looks at what we can do over the next 35 years to try and get to, I guess, an ideal option. For me, when I look at it and look at the Maori assessment, I'm not Maori, but when I look at the Maori assessment, option 2 was actually the 8th preferred option. It wasn't the first preferred, it wasn't the second preferred, it wasn't even the third preferred, it was the 8th preferred option. And so when I'm looking at what our goals should be trying to get to and having that as an aspect in there, option 6 ends up being the second most preferred option in the assessments that we've seen so far. The most preferred option for everybody in all the different scenarios is actually to treat it at the highest possible level. Option 2 gives us that. It is treating it to level 4, which none of the other options are doing. So at this point in time, I am supporting option 2, treating it to the highest potential level, with the amendment in there to try and get us moving more towards keeping it open for land, for increasing the land side of things. So I'm supporting what we have with option with the amendment there.
We've got 18% of the land in around the Manawatu is class 1 and 2 soils. That New Zealand has got 18% of the 1 and 2% class soils. So we don't want to be taking, and I disagree with Councillor Finlay, we have not put a proposal forward to take class 1 and 2 soils. Over my dead body would that happen, because we have been fighting for years to keep those soils through our district plan. So we'd have to look at alternatives, and it's got to be the right soil. So just to go back, so we have to make the best practical option, and to me that is option 2, and I don't want to even take the land, because I think people do underestimate the impact to communities. And also Mr. Warburton talked about the risks around, we'll be one of the biggest councils in New Zealand discharging to land, even with the 760 hectares. So that's problematic, and I've been out and done all the field, walked around about 10 different wastewater treatment stations, and we've seen in the past what issues we've had. And coming through from all the consultations that I've been to was, please treat it the best possible way. I even had people saying, why couldn't we spend over $1 billion and do what Singapore's doing? So we've got the extreme from that to putting 100% to land. So for me, I think when I weigh up and filter through everybody's comments, to me the best compromise is the river. It's a clear, odourless, sterile discharge. It will sort out the issues that we've got, and we've still got to sort out the other 30 or 40 discharges that go on the river. Just us changing our discharge isn't going to clean that river up. We've got to start working on every input into that river. So for me, that's the start of where we should be going, and I certainly can't support this recommendation. I'll be supporting what's been put up and coming. So I think that's enough. Thank you.
Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just want to make a clarification first. I'm also a bit worried that after spending this much money and hundreds and thousands of dollars even on communication, one of our very senior councillors doesn't understand that we will not be discharging sewerage on the land. It will be treated water and treated to a highest degree. Number two, when I look at this amendment, it doesn't talk about taking 2,000 hectares. And the mover has clearly indicated that he should technology to reduce quantity of water. 53% of the water, maybe after 35 years, 53% of the treated water, maybe half of the water we are producing now. So it is misunderstood. When I look at option 6, I'm not looking on the right side, I'm only looking at the left side, which says 53% to the land. It doesn't say, the amendment doesn't say at all that 2,000 hectares will be consumed. So I'm happy to support this amendment. Thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Yes, I support the comments of Councillor Butt. I'm certainly going to support this amendment. I've spoken because they've seen the words option 6 in the amendment, have misinterpreted the meaning of the amendment. The meaning of the amendment is to lock in increasing diversion rates away from the river. It's not to lock in increased amounts of land. And we've heard from the experts this morning that the diversion rates away from increased in all sorts of ways, by reducing demand, by increasing technology, by finding alternative uses. So this amendment is not committing us to do option 6. What it's doing is it's committing us to a specific target for increasing diversion rates. And that's why I'm supporting it. It's not enough for me that after all of the consultation we've done with community, where we've heard repeatedly about people's concern for the river, that we simply go with option 2, which is not at all aspirational in my view. In fact, it's a good starting point, but it's not where I want us to finish up. And if we don't put something in at this stage, councillors, to be specific about what are around diversion from the river, then we'll end up in the kind of vague and woolly language that allows anything to be considered an improvement. What we need is specific targets around time and around amount, so that minds are focused on what we can do. And I think there'll be a lot of disappointed people in the community if we were to sign off option 2 today with no aspiration for increasing the amount of diversion from the river. Option 2 is a really minimal amount. It's only when the river is below a very low flood would there be diversion away from the river, and not a whole lot at that. So I think you've really got to be careful that you're not responding just to one or two loud voices that you've heard in the last couple of weeks. You need to think about the whole community, everybody who's made their views, hundreds of people that have made their views known. And I think it would be fair to say that the majority of people would prefer us to protect the river as much as we can. So I'm happy with the level of treatment in option 2, but I'm not happy in terms of it being aspirational enough. It's not an aspirational target to say that we're only going to do it at very low flows and then still only 75% to land at that point. So I just think you need to be very careful that the amendment says nothing about the amount of land. And it would be possible, as we've heard this morning, to use adaptive management in terms of the different methods that have been discussed to achieve that diversion rate. It's nothing to do with the amount of land. And one final point around high-class soils. We've heard quite a lot of emotive comments about that this morning. Remind you all that there's an NPS in development on protecting high-class soils. And in order to be able to consent this, we have to be in line with all the NPSs, all the national policy statements. And there's no way that we will be allowed to use high-class soils to discharge wastewater on under the RMA. So that's just a red herring. And it's been used, I think, by some people that are perhaps not fully understanding the situation. So I'd urge you to be a little more aspirational and to support the amendment. Thank you.
Okay, is there anybody else? Oh, Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Kia ora. The first point I'd like to make is one around a principled point around good decision making. I think it's absolutely presumptive to question a councillor wanting to present a slide to support his arguments on this recommendation. I think it's hypothetical, his recommendation, because if this passes, it makes his proposal redundant. And so therefore, with his Councillor Hancock's permission, I'd like to request it be presented. Because I think the ruling not to allow it was 100% wrong in my view.
Councillor, I've made the decision. I'm not going to go back on it. But if this fails, of course, Councillor will have his opportunity to put it up.
Okay, I'll express that. So that's fine. Thank you. Again, I think that's unfortunate. The second point around the 53% being proposed as the amendment disguises the fact that in our recent reports, that equates to 2,000 hectares of land. That's the parallel. And so I don't want to disguise that fact. And again, I think it's fundamentally flawed because in the reports to date, it says going with that option is with a level 2 treatment. What's been tagged on here is disposing it with a level 4 treatment. So therefore, I make the parallel that that is extremely expensive, with the cost much higher than what was proposed in the report. The other part around the Landcare maps that we've been outlined that the poor soil quality and the class 1 and 2 soil compromise and iwi's and mana whenua's desire to keep discharge within our territory inside the city boundary creates a very limiting option for us. For people to understand the size of the territory 2,000 hectares is, I think it's important for members and the wider public to understand what 760 hectares looks like in the first point. And what Councillor Hancock was trying to describe visually, and I'd love to see to support my argument on this point, is that that does take up a quarter of our city, inner city's urban area, from Fitzherbert Ave down Pioneer Highway to, I think, to Wanaka Road to the river. It's enormous. And to go over 2.5 times that size to have a land acquired for discharge, I don't think it's practical. When we're looking at a best practical option, I don't think it's best, and I certainly question its practicality. And the compromising impact on our community is way too high for my comfort level, and I believe for the wider city and even our neighbouring communities that have had limited consultation on the size of that issue. So they're my points on this amendment. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Was there anybody else wishing to speak? Okay, then I'll come back to you, Councillor Barrett, for right reply.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, colleagues, for comments. My first point in reply is that I reject the notion that this is dangerous. We have heard repeatedly from the technical advisors we've had about how water conservation, how new technology can be used over time to achieve this very outcome. So we're not talking about something that's dangerous here. We're talking about something that's eminently achievable, and that's achievable without needing a vast new quantity of land. This fundamentally is about giving ourselves certainty and about giving the community certainty and transparency about where we intend to go, about being ambitious for our future as a city, staying future focused, prioritizing the moderation and health of our river, and having a robust long-term solution. Without this amendment, we end up with a great deal of uncertainty about what, if anything, might happen beyond option 2. This is a way of giving an enduring certainty to the direction of travel for the city, and I would urge you to support it on that basis.
All right, thank you, councillors. What we're going to do is division. So it's been called for, and I'll now pass it to Hannah.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can I just ask the tech team to send out the motion so that those that are remote are able to read it also? Brilliant, thank you. Okay, on the amendment that is before us, councillors. Councillor Naylor.
Against.
Councillor Dingwall. Can I just get you to say that again, please, Councillor Dingwall?
For.
Thank you. Councillor Beattie.
Against.
Councillor Meehan.
Against.
Councillor Harpeter.
Against.
Councillor McKillard.
Against.
Councillor Hancock.
Against.
Deputy Mayor Rutherford.
For.
Councillor Bowen.
For.
Thank you. Councillor Barrett.
For.
Councillor Petrinas.
Against.
Councillor Finlay.
Against.
Councillor Dennison.
Against.
Mayor Smith.
Against.
Councillor Johnson.
For.
Councillor Butt.
For.
And the amendment has failed, 6 votes for and 10 against. Right, we have the second amendment, which was signalled at the start. Councillor Hancock, if we can all get that up. And I'll read that, and then the councillor will want his slide up as well after that. So this again is around the approval of the best practical option for Palmerston North wastewater solution. And the amendment is that council adopts as the best practical option for managing wastewater from Palmerston North for the next 50 years, option 2 with the highest practical treatment of level 4 and a minimum 75% diversion of wastewater from the river when the river flow is below half median, and that the land acquisition is restricted to 760 hectares, including buffer zones, for the purpose of this wastewater consent. It's moved by Councillor Hancock and seconded by Councillor Harpeter. Councillor, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. If I could just get that map up, just so that we've actually got a visual in terms of land area. So thank you very much for that. Look, I obviously had a lot to say during the previous amendment. So for brevity, I'm not going to repeat everything that I have said previously, other than really just to kind of sort of remind you of the various planks of the argument to actually adopt 760 hectares, and that it would be limited to that area of land for the purposes of this consent. You know, it's as I mentioned earlier, it is a very, very significant piece of land, and if we actually turn our minds to you know, the stipulations that have been made by both Mana Whenua and iwi, and that is it's their preference that any wastewater is actually distributed to a land area within our TLA boundaries. And as you can see by the size of that piece of land there, if we actually moved that even to the south side of the river, that's actually going to take in all of Massey, all out through Linton, and include as far out to Linton Military Camp and also Marotu Prison. So it's a very, very significant tract of land. Obviously, there are a number of people that already have established farms and lifestyle blocks and everything else like that in those kinds of areas. And as I mentioned earlier, if you are in the receiving environment, you are a key stakeholder, or potential, if you are potentially in the receiving environment, you are a key stakeholder in this process. And the decisions that we make at this table have a direct bearing on the life and the well-being of those people. So therefore, we must be cognizant of the pleas and the submissions that have been made by people to this entire process. As I said earlier, among other things under the RMA, we must be cognizant of the effects on people and communities, and that is not constrained to the people that actually live within the city boundaries. If we're contemplating applying wastewater to areas outside of our territorial boundary, then those people are also key stakeholders. Option 2, constrained to 760 hectares. The advantage of that is that we actually have some known costs. It's actually already been provided to us through the very comprehensive document which has been prepared by the project team. So I think probably the last point I'd make is that if we actually constrain the land to 760 hectares, any future progress of the project, it will mean that our people who are actually going to acquire land are going to acquire land that is the most receptive to wastewater. So those are my submissions, Mr Mayor, just in terms of supporting this amendment. Thank you.
Councillor Hapara.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. I also want to support this, as I did second the motion, but I also think restricting it to 760 hectares just gives some assurance to our community that we are doing that. I think as a project, putting that assurance out to the community is what we need to do going forward. I think putting it out to 2,000 hectares or whatever that was is not a good thing for our community, and I think this just gives a bit more assurance going forward. So that's why I am supporting this motion. Thank you. This amendment. Thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. I'm not going to be supporting this amendment. The question was asked of our technical advisors and project lead, David Warburton, what the risks were of a land cap. And what he said was, and I wrote it down because I was aware of Councillor Hancock's proposed amendment, that it might give councillors comfort, but it's not ideal. That if conditions change, we might need more land than 760 hectares to be able to enact option 2, and that it's not practical to put a cap on the land that's required. And so for those reasons, I won't be supporting it. The other thing to consider in this is that if we artificially constrain the amount of land that's required at this stage, we're just making a rod for our own backs. We've already decided, well, we haven't decided, but we've already, in principle, agreed with option 2, and we should be taking the advice of the experts, as I think Councillor Naylor told us, to listen to their advice, not introducing an extra restriction that might make it more difficult to enact option 2. So I think we need to put the emotive arguments aside and just go with the recommendation at this point. Thank you.
Councillors, before I come to you, I'll speak. Look, I will support this, and I just would like you to have a download that at some stage from the New Zealand Listener just out in the last day, and I think that'll give you a good idea of why we're going in this direction. Look, land is not the panacea. It's not the silver bullet. I spent 4 years and more actually than some of the councillors that have joined me in more recent times on this BPO journey. It does have aspiration. I get a bit jilted when people that say that, and I've spent 60 meetings. I think it's been said that one of the other councillors said that there was no option which everybody liked. You went out to Foxton and they don't want it in the river. You go to the rural community, they don't want it on land. People in the city want the best possible treatment and a bit of a hybrid. And the cost to be the lowest, really, really difficult. So that's why it is the best practicable option. So, coming back to the treatment, everyone said that treatment needed to be the highest. So I think we've got that part right, and I think we're probably 100% committed on that. Then there was the discharge, and that's why we're coming to this. And I just want to acknowledge the farming community as well. The city was built on the land, and it is still connected to the land. We have to be good neighbours, and we do need to give them some surety as well. I was just talking to some farmers this week. They're making decisions around improvements to their land. They now feel we might be coming to grab it. And even if we said, oh, we may come and have a look at it in 10 or 20 years' time, that still doesn't give that business, which is a farming business, surety. So we've got to be good neighbours as well. We either put a ring round it or leave it open. I favour putting a ring round it, and again, we can all be... I wrote down too what David Warburton, the chair, said, and he said there was actually quite a buffer in the land. So I have no problems with them coming back to a future council and asking for, or us, if we're lucky enough to be here after this, that they come back and approach us for more land. But I think we have to give our neighbours, including our other territorial authorities, an understanding of where this might sit. This option puts it more in the Palmerston North, maybe not all, but majority in the Palmerston North boundary. If we just leave it open, I do have some fears that we will be all over the place. So please, I ask you to support this. I do think it is the best option. It is a difficult decision, but it is the best practicable option. So I ask you to support it. Councillor Denison.
Kia ora, Mr Mayor. Points I wanted to add on this debate is I'm going to support it. About ambition, and the previous one wasn't ambitious enough, or this isn't ambitious enough for our future. It's still going to be the biggest in New Zealand. And if that's not ambitious, I'm not quite sure what will be. As far as the cost, it's the biggest project on any scale the city's ever embarked on, 350 million up to near 500 million. That's pretty ambitious. The other thing around the risk, and also a question posed to the chair, David Warburton, around what sort of risk exists if we just stick to 760 hectares. The response was, don't think it's a big risk. I look forward to watching that again on YouTube later for the sound bites of today's meeting. The understanding also that any discharge to river or land is at level 4. The best quality water discharge expected in New Zealand. I have a great degree of comfort around that. And finally, a point, almost quoting you, Mr Mayor, around the future flexibility around having options pursued along the course of this consent, rather than just ring fencing future councils to the diversion of a percentage around more to land, when there's other actions this council can take and likely to, around extra technologies, around, we talked about reverse osmosis, repairing the stormwater network. This will make a big impact. Encouraging more primary treatment of trade waste, developing and recharging wetlands, irrigation on council reserves, as well as reducing wastewater we domestically use at source. And we can take a more holistic approach to limiting wastewater discharge in its total. So I have a great degree of comfort around this proposal. I think it does give some assurity around cost and size of land being pursued, and I think for those reasons this will have wide support from our wider community. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I will be supporting this amendment for many of the reasons I already outlined previously. But I just want to touch on a couple of things. Firstly, I think it's disappointing to hear an elected member say that they think that option 2 is not aspirational. Option 2 provides the highest level in the country treatment to our wastewater. If that's not aspirational, then I don't know what is. I think it treats it to an exceedingly good level that's the highest in the country. I think that's a very significant thing. Both option 1 and option 2 included that level of treatment. And in terms of my preference, I would have been comfortable with a hybrid between option 1 and 2 to actually treat it to the highest level, but with the less land than's outlined. So for that reason, I'm happy to to support an amendment that caps the area of land to 760, especially when the only risk in that is if down the track, many years down the track, if it was deemed that more land than that was needed, that would have to come back to the council of the day. I am still concerned with the level of potential land that involves and the social impact and the cost of that. I hope that we can achieve the outcome that the consent and an outcome using much less land than that, but certainly I'll be supporting capping the land at the very least. Yeah, I'll leave it at that, thanks.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm unable to support this because limiting options at this stage is quite an unwise move when we're at this phase of actually becoming the applicant in a massive resource consent process. We need to have flexibility to be able to work within that context, and limiting options at this stage weakens our position going into that resource consenting process. I'll give you a couple examples. We've heard how this might help contain costs or give us known costs. Well, that's making some huge assumptions that we don't actually, through artificially constraining one option, force ourselves into higher cost other options that might be required because we've said zero flexibility here, forcing ourselves into potential costs in other places. The other thing that we're very likely to do with this is to take what could be an enduring, long-term, intergenerational, yes, aspirational direction of travel for this city and constrain it into a very short-term resource consent that will be subject to intensive review and very likely very short-term, triggering, guess what, this whole same process again with millions and millions of dollars being spent by this community to yet again reevaluate options within a very short number of years. What we need is a long-term solution that looks after and protects the health of the river, that respects the full range of voices in the community, and that gives us options and flexibility as we navigate a challenging and complex stage of this Nature Calls project, i.e. the development of specific resource consent option. So we'd be most unwise at this point to be effectively tying one hand behind our back before going in to that next stage. And I'd urge you to reject this amendment on that basis, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Barn.
For this project. Also.
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I've heard a lot of use of the words aspiration and ambitious, and it seems that the understanding of what those words mean is very broad, very, very, very broad. Treated wastewater, and we did a slightly less terrible job, it seems that we would be labelled both aspirational and ambitious. So there's some food for thought. Look, I think that this amendment here is putting a limit on progress. I hold further concerns with this amendment around what kind of environment we are setting up to leave future generations. And this kind of cap is restricting opportunities quite significantly in the future. I think it's short-sighted, and I absolutely won't be supporting it.
Any other? No? I'll come back to you, Councillor Hancock, for a right to reply.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I'm just going to be really brief in terms of response. Just to really touch base on the comments around David Warburton and what he said when he was addressing us earlier, is that he did say that any extension to land would actually have to come back to council anyway. And just by restricting it under this particular process does not mean that at some time in the future, if we're unable to get the desired outcomes that we actually want to, we can always come back to some future council. But he also said, when he was addressing us, that any extension to the land also carries significant risk in terms of it becomes a very, very complex process in terms of being able to actually manage that and all the subsequent outcomes from that. The next point really is just to say that adaptive management is included, and it's dotted right throughout the documentation that we've already been given. And it's adaptive management that will give us the ability to show the innovation that we can, in fact, apply to get the results that we want. It's that management process and the cleverness of the people involved in that process that will continue to reduce wastewater going to our awa. Constraining areas of land provides us with some certainty around cost. It's not an exact science. Lots of those things are estimates at the moment. Comparative, some comparative looks at the difference between option 2 and option 6, option 11, whatever it might be. Intent, us showing what our intent is. And it's not just the team of Palmerston North, it's the team of Palmerston North and the community that we serve and that they support us. So they deserve our support. So that's my response. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. A division has been requested again, so I'll now pass to Hannah, our Governance Manager.
Thanks. Councillors who are online, you should have the amendment in front of you. We have it on the screen in front of us. The amendment, Councillor McCallard.
In favour.
Councillor Butt.
Against.
Councillor Dingwall. Councillor Barrett.
Against.
Deputy Mayor Rutherford.
Against.
Councillor Harpeter.
For.
Councillor Johnson.
Against.
Councillor Meehan.
For.
Councillor Hancock.
For.
Councillor Dennison.
For.
Councillor Petrinas. For. Councillor Naylor.
For.
Councillor Finlay.
For.
Councillor Beattie.
For.
Mayor Smith.
For.
Councillor Bowen.
For.
And the amendment has passed, 11 votes for and 5 against. Thank you. Okay, we now need just to vote on the substantive.
Can we have a division, please?
Yeah. We'll just get that up if we can, please. All right, we've got some technical hitches, so we'll just we will just have a moment.
Our apologies, members. We don't seem to be able to get the screen up for you at this time. So what I'll do is just read aloud the motion as a substantive now. So with that amendment attached that we have agreed as a meeting, that Council adopts as the best practicable option for managing wastewater from Palmerston North for the next 50 years, option 2, with the highest practicable treatment level, level 4, and a minimum 75% diversion of wastewater from the river when the river flow is below half median, and that land acquisition is restricted to 760 hectares, including buffer zones, for the purpose of this wastewater consent. Moved by the Mayor and seconded by Councillor Johnson.
Mr Mayor, I'd like to withdraw my seconding of that motion. I can't support it. Thank you.
Can I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Hancock.
Moved by the Mayor and seconded by Councillor Hancock.
Okay, councillors, I'm not going to repeat. I'm not going to speak to it. I think we've just basically, it's word for word what we've just done. But if any other councillors would like to speak to it, then I'll give you the opportunity. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I have supported the amendment, and I'm pleased that the restriction on the land area has been supported by the majority of councillors. However, as I have indicated before, I have significant concerns that option 2 does still not meet the objective of being affordable and cost effective. And my view on that is actually whether we go with Three Waters entity or not, I still think the cost falls on this community. And I guess as well as that, I'm also concerned at the social impact of that level, the level that's involved in option 2, I still think is too high. I'm supportive of the level 4 treatment, and in fact, the level 4 treatment, and in order to achieve that, does actually fall within the budget that we have set in our long-term plan. I would have preferred, as I said, some sort of hybrid between option 1 and 2, where less land was used, and if that is an option in the future, I would absolutely support it. But I cannot support an option that is unaffordable, unfundable, and detrimental to the social impact, social fabric of our community. So I just wanted to explain that in terms of my reason for not supporting this motion.
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'm not going to be supporting the recommendations today. I had hoped that I might be able to support prior to the amendments, but I absolutely can't put my name to supporting them as they stand. We heard that this morning that there were 3 components of this, which was the treatment, the discharge and the management. The treatment being the highest level of treatment currently available in New Zealand at what's called the level 4. I absolutely support that. I think that that is a significant move for the city to agree to that, and what I imagine will be leading the way for other councils in terms of treatment. So I absolutely support that. What I don't support is essentially what we are agreeing to be the discharge and management. I find the recommendation looking at how we're managing wastewater for the next to be a decision that I'm sure in future will be seen as subpar, not good enough. And we're locking ourselves in and limiting the ability to progress on land discharge with the amendments that have been agreed. And I genuinely believe that people are going to find this decision unacceptable. And I'm not talking in 50 years when this decision expires. I'm thinking in a few years' time, it's going to be a decision that people are going to find unacceptable, that we are agreeing for the next 50 years for daily wastewater discharge into our river. That's what we are agreeing to. Recommendation 2, which touches on exploring other options, I find extremely problematic. The word explore has got no commitment to it. It's got no outcomes. It's got no security around progress. In theory, if we are looking at what others are doing, not necessarily agreeing to make any changes or putting steps in place to see changes, we have met that recommendation. And so I'm feeling incredibly disappointed that after 4 years of this, to be voting against it. I genuinely, even at the beginning of today, did not think that I would be in this position, but I cannot put my name to these recommendations and stand by them and say I agree that that was the best outcome. And so I'll be voting against these today.
Sorry, Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I also will not be able to support this substantive with the amendment and without the amendment that Councillor Barrett proposed. 2 weeks ago, we had a really good paper come to Council in which there was included that the BPO would also include increasing the proportion of diversion to land over time to look to approach the proportional split between river and land achieved with options 6 and 7. And I was very disappointed to see that in the recommendations that we were presented with today, that intention wasn't expressed. Instead, there's a very vague indication of adaptive management being used to increase diversion, but without targets and without specificity, we could be left in exactly the same situation where we're discharging to the river every single day. And that is not the community's aspiration for how we would treat our river. And I think, never mind in a few years' time, as the Deputy Mayor says, I think there'll be people in the community extremely disappointed if this decision goes through today. Extremely disappointed. This is a long way from where I hoped we would be. And I'm honestly speechless. I cannot support this.
Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. At this stage, it's just confirming my understanding that the recommendation 2 that was in our order paper has not been moved.
No, I've got an amendment to that. Which
so that's coming. I just want to. So it's just on this. No, this has my support, and for the reasons outlined, I just really wanted to query the following recommendations, and if it hasn't been called for already, a division. Thank you.
Councillor Harpiter.
Exactly the same as Councillor Jensen. I fully support the recommendation that's up on the screen. Thank you.
Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I fully support the recommendation, and I'd just like to add that the decision today, as a council, we don't walk away from the river or anything else. In all of our programs, we can start looking at diversion, and diversion does not necessarily mean to land. There's huge amounts of technology going on in Scotland and all sorts of places that if you've searched the internet, it's amazing what's happening with wastewater. So in 5 years' time, we might have disrupted a whole lot of the community, have to abandon their land, and we don't actually have to do that. And there's education, there's all the things that Councillor Dennison mentions, the stormwater that goes to the river, all sorts of stuff. So I totally disagree with that. I think we, as a council, need to start looking at diversion. The next environmental committee or whatever, which one we're doing, we can still work on it. We won't be just putting it on the shelf saying, well, that project's over. We'll look at it in 50 years' time.
Now, was there any other councillors? Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. 2 weeks ago, this was actually looking reasonably good, but actually quite a lot of what was in that paper has evaporated since then. And what we don't see today is firm commitment. And without commitment, without clarity of direction, there is no way that I'm prepared to support this in this restricted form that we now see. Honestly, 2021 signing off on 50 years of continuous discharge to the river. That is nonsense. And I don't think, honestly, that we're setting ourselves up to get a resource consent. I think we're setting ourselves up for a very expensive and difficult next stage of this project without having a certainty of getting further out of the river and continuous improvement over time. The words have been said, but there is no certainty in terms of where this goes. So it really fails in terms of actually enhancing and protecting the health of the river into the future. It fails in terms of giving certainty of progress over time, and for those reasons, I'm unable to support it, which is a great regret because, yes, I have invested 4 years and a lot of energy in this process through the project steering group, and to see it come apart in this way over the last couple of weeks is quite disappointing. So, unable to support the substantive on those bases.
Thank you, councillors. I wasn't going to have a right to reply, but I just feel I have to. I mean, Councillor Beattie summed it up. We've sat in those meetings with you, councillor, as well, and I find it unbelievable that it's getting painted as we're not going to get out of the river. Best practical option. To paint it, people that don't even come to meetings, saying we've got no ambition. Absolute bollocks. I'm sorry, it isn't. This needs to be done in a managed way that doesn't absolutely make the city bankrupt and also brings all our stakeholders with us. We've got people down the back of the rooms who farms might go in something, and some of you can sit there and just be, it really annoys me. We have come on a journey, and at the 11th hour we're trying to get political mileage on this. This city is going to do fantastic work in this space, and I'm really annoyed that we've got political at the 11th hour. If you can't vote for this, I don't know what you can vote for. This is absolutely going to get out of the river. Not in the time frame that a certain councillor or two wants, but it will get there. So please support it, strongly support it. Thank you. Sorry, division was called for.
Can I just get the substantive motion out to the councillors who are online, please? Sorry, can I just get the tech team to swap so that... thank you very much. Perfect. Okay, on the substantive motion before you, Councillor Finlay.
For.
Councillor Meehan.
For.
Councillor Beattie. For. Councillor Butt.
Against.
Councillor Bowen.
For.
Councillor Naylor.
Against.
Councillor Dennison.
For.
Councillor Hancock.
For.
Mayor Smith.
For.
Councillor Barrett.
Against.
Councillor Dingwall. I'll just wait for your sound to kick in, Councillor Dingwall. Could you tell us that again? I'm lip reading that you're saying against. Against. Deputy Mayor Rutherford.
Against.
Councillor McKellard.
For.
Councillor Johnson.
Against.
Councillor Harpiter.
For.
Councillor Petrinas. Councillor Petrinas, I didn't hear your response. Oh, we seem to have lost the sound. Okay, I can see that you're for.
And the substantive motion is passed 10 for and 6 against. Councillors, we have one more amendment and then a further recommendation. I would hope that they may be relatively quick, but I'm unsure now because where things are going. We'll try the amendment first and we'll just see where we go with that. I'm thinking of timing. So can we get the amendment up, please, for number 2? If we can just change the wording there, it should be an alternative motion, so we don't have to go back to the substantive. So this is around, and councillors, is number 2 is around approval of the best practical option for Palmerston North wastewater solution. It's confirmation of council's support to continue exploring other practical options to increase the diversion of wastewater from the river during the period of the consent through the adoption of an adaptive management approach. I've moved that and seconded by Councillor Petrinas. And if I could just say, this actually was, it was actually in our paper. It was in page 20, number 5 of our report. It's more technical in the nature that it absolutely locks in the adaptive management approach. We need that, and a lot of councillors have spoken about the need to get out of the river quicker, and this will enable us to do it. We'll talk about how that could be done, and there were many ways that were described earlier today by David Warburton, our chair of the steering group. It's not all land. Land isn't the silver bullet, but there are many other ways. Our stormwater network is one, our education, and what they call up the pipe, ensuring that we don't use as much water. And we know with the regulator coming on board that there will be probably some conditions around what cities use in terms of their water. So I'm absolutely positive that we will make more improvements in diversion from the river, but we do need to move this motion to give our consent team the understanding of what we're after. So I'd like you to support it, please. I'll open it up for any other comments. Councillor Petrinas. Councillor, we just can't hear you, but we're just trying to switch you on now.
Think. Okay, thank you. Hello, Hannah.
Lost the sound through Teams. So are you comfortable if I put you on speakerphone and put you up to my microphone?
With my phone, yeah. Okay, all right. Yep. Okay, thank you. Hello, everybody. Well, looking at the adaptive management scheme, goodness, I'm getting feedback, will be the key to our success. Now, I know I've listened intently to what has been said today.
No, it's not working. Bruno, it's not working. It's just too much feedback, unfortunately. Would you like to type the messages to me?
Okay, I'll open it up for any other comments. Councillor Naylor.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I am actually happy to support this recommendation. I do think we need to remain flexible through this process. I agree with comments that have been made that land is not the silver bullet, and if we can, I support the concept of diversion of wastewater from the river, especially if we can do that through mechanisms that don't have an impact on landowners and productive land. So certainly I think we should always be open to new technology, new strategies, strategies. I guess my only caution around this is that I would hope that as we look at those options, that we consider them as potential alternative strategies rather than just doing that as well as what is already in the option that's before us in option 1, in option 2. As I've said, the land in option 2 is still a significantly large, potentially large piece of land, and if we can find other ways to divert the wastewater, then I think that is preferable.
All right. Look, just as a right of reply, just a couple of other things that I probably didn't make clear. This approach and motion provides certainty around diversion from the river, which we all want, across a range of measures. It also gives some rigour to ensuring that that happens. There was also, it gives council surety that it's got to work with iwi and other stakeholders to achieve that. So we've got to have it in there somewhere. So again, ask you for your support and no division called for. I think we'll just do it with a show of hands if that is okay. Great, okay. All those in favour? Against? Abstain? It's passed 100%, thank you. Now the final motion, if I could get that up. I'll start to read it out so we're not waiting for too long. Is really around how are we going to do this going forward? How does this consent, how do we include iwi, how do we propose to work going forward, including the adaptive management approach? So it's around a strategy and developed by Council with the involvement of the Rangatane and iwi within the region who continue to be involved in our process and our consent. This may be developed under an agreed project partnership or a governance group to be determined upon providing the BPO. It is recommended that this group establish the adaptive management strategy in order to define the resource consent and may continue to be established as part of the consent delivery over time. This group needs to be formed in consultation with Rangatane and iwi in the first instance. So I've moved that and it's been seconded by Councillor Petrinas, and it gives a clear way forward in our coming months, because the journey will have only just started in that sense. So I'll open it up for any other comments. Councillor Naylor.
It's a question really more than a comment. I guess what I'm wanting to know is if we support this, how would that be any different to what's going to happen anyway?
It ensures that we've got Rangatane and iwi in the consent process.
I thought officers confirmed
yes,
that
they've indicated they have, but this locks it in.
And the that's been corrected. AMS. Okay. Thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
I'd appreciate a bit more explanation of what this is, how it would be constituted, who'd be involved. It's just come at the 11th hour and haven't really had any opportunity to understand what this is about.
It's forming a governance group to ensure that we've got lots of stakeholders. We've heard from some of them today, we heard from some of them a couple of weeks ago. We've had iwi involved, multiple iwi. It's ensuring that they are. At the moment, we pass all of that over, and I'm unsure whether iwi and Rangatane are going to be part of the group going forward. I'm sure they probably would be, but this would ensure that they are. I've run this by officers and I haven't had negative comments. Councillor Dennison.
Mr Mayor, just really a wordsmith, in that second part of it where it says it is recommended that this group, I wonder, because this is the resolution, that it just says that this group rather than that it is recommended. It's just a bit more definite.
Yeah.
If that assists.
That's fine, if we could just change that, please. Just hold Councillor Naylor. I'll come to you.
Sorry, Mr Mayor, further question. I'm still trying to get my head around what the purpose of this. So is this instead of the steering group? Is the steering group going to be disestablished?
My understanding, the steering group does get disestablished and we now move into a consent process.
Is there a way that we could have some officer comment to give some better context to this? Because this is, like someone else has said, a bit last minute, and we haven't got any information from officers around this, or what the options, what would the other options be of a way forward if it wasn't this? Like if we don't support this, then what would happen?
Yeah, okay. Well, if we don't support it, I suppose we hope that it gets continued. I have actually put it through the officers and I haven't got a negative comment. So if they want to comment.
Yes, I will comment as a point of clarification. So we are presently scoping up what a steering group or something like that would look in the next stage. Will definitely be involved in that. I think the best thing as part of that may be the development of a terms of reference, which could be brought back to this group to discuss, if that was what the council wished.
Councillor Naylor.
Mr Mayor, would you be open to adjusting that to be subject to the terms of reference coming for endorsement by council?
Yeah, happy. I just want to see it happen. To give you an understanding, we're 2 months behind on where we're going with this, so I do want to see it happening.
Did you want me to move that as an amendment, or were you happy to include that?
I'll better check with my seconder if he's okay with that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a question of clarification as well. I'm not sure if to you or to the officers, but just to understand, would this group be taking the consent effectively across the finish line, or does this group bring that final consent form back to council before lodging?
I think they'd have to take it to the finishing line.
Qualified. Through the chair, this is part of what we're discussing at the moment, just to try and understand. So we haven't landed. The group would definitely have to be involved through the lodgement, if there's a hearing process and all that sort of stuff. Longer term governance hasn't been resolved yet, because I'm sure that will be fed into through the consent process and some of the conditions that come through the consent itself. Work in progress.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Okay, councillors. So we've got a couple of amendments there, subject to terms of reference being agreed by council. Thank you for that. That should be there. I'm probably just going to signal that, this is the start of the journey. We've got to this stage. We now need to move forward. Councillor Dennison.
Yes, Mr Mayor, I guess in a question, if that's okay, where we've got the terms of reference being agreed by council, but also the makeup of the membership of the group itself, and just how many members, how many iwi, and how many balance between Rangatane and the wider iwi. Will that come back full council for agreeing to? And I just would say that's the normal process, but that is another element that I think
the group needs to be formed in consultation with Rangatane and iwi in the first instance. But it could come back to council with the terms of reference.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with that. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay. All right. Okay, if there's no division being asked for, we'll do it with a show of hands. All those in favour? Against? Abstain? It's passed 15-1. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, councillors. Thank you, staff. Thank you to those that are online. It's been a big day today, and I appreciate everybody's past work and work that will go on in the future. I just want to mention a couple of people that have put a huge amount of work in over the last probably 6 years actually, but there have been in more recent times councillors on board the BPO group, but want to acknowledge you, David Warburton, as chair, our independent chair, and your wise counsel around those regular meetings. Also to my council colleagues that have been on that journey with the BPO. I'm probably speaking that some other councils probably don't realise the amount of commitment and work that went on in that BPO group. It was massive. The fronting of quite interesting meetings right around the whole city and regional landscape. Also to our officers that have been, there's been officers come and go a bit on this project, I also want to acknowledge the technical team, to Robert Van Bentum, who's one of our officers, but he's been there from the most of the start. Also to the project manager, Malena Voss, and to our technical expert, Jim Bradley. So everybody else that's been involved. As I said, I think earlier, we're really only through the first stage. And the rest of it starts from now. So, hence motion 3 too. So, thank you. We are now. We'll break for lunch, I think. It's been a long morning because we've still got part 2 to go. Councillor Hapeta.
We are starting economic development at 2 o'clock.
We can start it at 1 and adjourn. There's ways around that. We've done it before. Oh.
Excuse me, Mr. Mayor. I wonder if we move into part 2 now and then hang around for a few minutes, and then we can adjourn this meeting, hang around for a few minutes, open Councillor Harpeta's committee, and then break for lunch because we have to open at 1.
Yeah. Okay.
Publicly notified.
Yep. Fair comment. All right, I thought we were at 12, not 1. Okay, so now will council now resolve that the public be excluded? We'll move into part 2. I'll look to move that, seconded by the Deputy Mayor. I'll do that with a show of hands. Against? Abstain? It's passed unanimously, thank you. Just need a few minutes to sort things out.